Most people believe calm comes from solving every thought, from finding the right answer, fixing the past, preparing for every possible future. But what if the real reason the mind feels so heavy is not because of the thoughts themselves? What if it's because we keep trying to carry them all? There's a quiet exhaustion many people know well, the kind that shows up late at night, when the room is silent but the mind refuses to rest. A conversation from earlier keeps replaying. A mistake from years ago suddenly returns as if it just happened. And somewhere between those memories and tomorrow's worries, the mind begins collecting more and more weight. Strangely enough, the more we try to control these thoughts, the tighter they seem to grip us back. We analyze them, replay them, wrestle with them, hoping that one more round of thinking will finally bring peace. But instead, the mind becomes crowded, like a small room filled with too many boxes no one remembers bringing inside. Yet there's an old idea, simple and almost forgotten, that suggests something very different. Calm doesn't arrive when we control every thought. It arrives when we stop trying to carry them all. In a small town, beside a quiet fountain, a man once discovered this in the most unexpected way. He believed he was simply thinking too much, but what he slowly realized was something deeper. He had been carrying a sack of invisible stones for years, and he had never once considered putting it down. His discovery was simple, almost too simple to notice at first. And yet, once he understood it, the weight he had carried for so long began to dissolve in a way he never thought possible. Let's step into his story. The weight of a thought can be strange like that. It arrives quietly, yet somehow settles as if it belongs there. In a small town tucked between dusty hills and slow afternoons, there lived a man named Daniel, who had grown used to carrying such weight. Not on his shoulders exactly, though some days it felt that way. No, his burden lived inside his mind, whispering long after the world had gone quiet, and truth be told, it rarely gave him a moment's rest. Daniel often walked through the narrow streets just after sunset, when the air cooled and the sky softened into shades of violet. Yet even in that gentle hour, his thoughts clung to him like stubborn shadows. A conversation from the morning would replay itself, word by word. A mistake from years ago might suddenly knock at the door of memory, as if it had unfinished business. And, oh, the future. The future liked to join the parade too, bringing a cart full of imagined worries. Sometimes he would pause beside the old stone fountain in the square and rub his forehead with tired fingers. Not because anything terrible had happened that day. In fact, most days were ordinary enough. But the mind has a curious habit, doesn't it? It gathers small moments the way pockets gather pebbles during a long walk. Before long, those pockets feel heavy, and the walker wonders why the journey feels harder than it should. If someone had looked closely at Daniel during those evenings, they might have imagined him carrying something invisible, a rough sack slung across his back perhaps, filled with stones of every shape and size. One stone for a careless word someone spoke years ago, another for the embarrassment of a small failure, another for a fear that hadn't even happened yet, though his mind insisted on rehearsing it anyway. And the odd thing was this: the sack seemed to grow heavier the longer he held on to it. Thoughts he meant to forget found their way back into the bag. Questions he couldn't answer rolled around inside it like loose gravel. By the time night settled in, Daniel felt as if he had been climbing a hill all day, even though he had barely left the town square. One evening, as he sat on the low wall near the fountain, he noticed how quiet the town had become. A single lantern flickered above a wooden door. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then thought better of it. The stillness felt almost inviting. Yet Daniel's mind refused to join the calm. It kept turning over the same worn worries like a restless hand shuffling old cards. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, imagining for a moment what it might feel like to set the sack down, just for a breath or two, to let the stones rest somewhere outside his head. The thought felt almost rebellious, like loosening a tight knot that had been tied for years. Still, another voice inside him whispered that letting go would be careless, irresponsible even. So he sat there, caught between two quiet instincts, one urging him to keep holding every thought, every memory, every imagined outcome, the other wondering, gently, curiously, whether calm might begin the moment a person stops trying to carry every stone alone. And though Daniel didn't know it yet, someone nearby had already noticed the invisible weight on his back. The next evening arrived with the same soft breeze that often wandered through the town at dusk. Daniel followed his usual path to the fountain, though the invisible sack on his back seemed heavier than usual. It wasn't just one thought now. It was dozens, tiny stones clinking together in the quiet corners of his mind. And the strange part was how tightly he held them, as if loosening his grip might cause something important to slip away. He had always believed that thinking harder meant being more responsible. If he replayed every conversation, maybe he could avoid future mistakes. If he imagined every possible outcome, perhaps he could protect himself from disappointment. So he carried the sack with quiet determination. Yet the more tightly he gripped those stones in his thoughts, the heavier they seemed to become. Sometimes he wondered whether other people carried sacks like his. The baker who whistled each morning, the old woman who watered her plants outside the blue house. They moved through the day with a certain ease, as though the air around them were lighter. Daniel would watch them and think, how do they walk so freely? One evening, while adjusting the imaginary weight on his shoulders, a small realization slipped through his tired mind. The stones themselves were not the strangest part of the burden. Thoughts appeared in every mind. That was simply the nature of being human. The true weight came from how tightly he held them, as if each one had to remain with him forever. It was a curious thing to consider. What if the sack felt so heavy, not because of the stones, but because he refused to loosen his grip? What if thoughts were never meant to be stored and sorted endlessly, like items in a crowded drawer? Perhaps they were more like passing clouds, drifting through a wide sky. Yet Daniel hesitated even entertaining that idea. Letting thoughts pass without gripping them felt suspiciously like giving up control. And he had spent years believing that control was the only thing keeping his world steady. Without it, he feared everything might fall apart, his decisions, his responsibilities, even his sense of who he was. Still, a quieter voice within him began to murmur something different. It wondered whether surrender was not the same as defeat, whether loosening his grip might actually be a form of trust that the mind could rest without abandoning wisdom. The idea felt unfamiliar, like a door in a familiar hallway he had somehow never noticed before. And as Daniel sat there, turning that thought gently in his mind, the lantern light flickered across the square. Just as a calm stranger approached the fountain, walking without the slightest hint of a burden on his back. The stranger didn't speak right away. He simply sat on the opposite side of the fountain, as if he had all the time in the world. Daniel noticed him only after a few moments, mostly because of the quiet ease the man carried. It was subtle yet unmistakable. While Daniel felt as if he were dragging a sack uphill, this man looked as though he had just stepped out of a calm morning breeze. Daniel tried to return to his thoughts, but the sack on his back had grown restless again. A careless comment from a coworker earlier that day replayed itself with annoying precision. Why did he say that? Did I sound foolish? The questions rolled around inside the bag like stubborn stones. He shifted slightly on the wall as though adjusting a weight no one else could see. The stranger eventually glanced at him with a warm, curious expression. Not the kind that intrudes, more the kind that quietly notices. Daniel nodded politely, though his mind was still tangled in its familiar loops. It had been doing that more often lately. Every mistake felt larger than it was, every uncertainty louder than necessary. At times, Daniel feared something was wrong with him. Other people seemed to move through their days with natural rhythm. Speak, laugh, let things go. But his mind insisted on replaying every awkward silence and every doubtful glance. The sack collected them all faithfully, and the strange thing was that he carried it willingly, convinced it was somehow his responsibility. Letting go in his mind felt almost dangerous. If he stopped analyzing everything, what if he missed something important? What if a lesson slipped past him unnoticed? The sack, heavy as it was, had become proof that he cared, proof that he was paying attention to life. But caring had quietly turned into exhaustion. The stones were multiplying. Words spoken months ago still echoed in his mind as if they had been said yesterday. Even kind moments sometimes found their way into the sack, twisted by doubt. Did they really mean that? And so Daniel sat beside the fountain, shoulders slightly tense, carrying a lifetime of tiny stones that no one else could see. Across from him, the stranger watched the evening sky with calm patience, as if he knew something about burdens, and about the quiet moment when a person finally begins to question why they're still holding them. That evening, the air carried the faint smell of rain, though the sky was still clear. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for a moment he imagined the sack on his back as something real, rough fabric, a frayed rope pulling against his shoulders. Inside it, dozens of small stones knocked gently together, each one holding a memory he hadn't managed to release. If someone had opened the sack, they would have found curious little weights. One smooth stone labeled that embarrassing moment from last winter. Another, slightly sharper one, carried the echo of a harsh sentence someone had spoken in anger. A heavier one held the quiet fear of being misunderstood. Daniel didn't place them there deliberately. They simply appeared one by one, whenever his mind refused to let something pass. The strange thing was how the sack behaved. The longer he carried it, the heavier it became. Thoughts he tried to solve grew stubborn, like knots pulled tighter with every tug. Even imagined worries, conversations that hadn't happened, mistakes that hadn't occurred, somehow slipped inside the bag, as if they belonged there too. Sometimes Daniel would close his eyes and try to remember when he had first picked up the sack. Childhood, perhaps. Or maybe the moment he began believing that every thought required careful attention, that every emotional bruise needed to be examined again and again. Somewhere along the way, the sack had become part of him. And yet, sitting there by the fountain, he realized something quietly absurd. The stones inside the sack never actually disappeared after he finished thinking about them. In fact, they seemed to multiply, like a drawer filled with old keys. The more he searched for the right one, the more cluttered the drawer became. He shifted his shoulders slightly, as if easing the invisible weight. A soft sigh escaped him. The stranger across the fountain noticed the gesture and tilted his head with mild curiosity. Not judgment, just the kind of gentle observation someone might have when watching a traveler adjust a heavy backpack. Daniel rubbed his hands together and stared down at the cobblestones beneath his feet. For the first time in a while, he wondered a quiet, almost playful question. What would happen if the sack were placed on the ground? Just for a moment, not forever perhaps, just long enough to see how his shoulders might feel without it. Across the fountain, the calm stranger seemed to sense that question forming, and his eyes held the faint, knowing smile of someone who had once carried a very similar sack. The stranger finally spoke when the evening had grown so quiet that even the fountain seemed to whisper instead of splash. His voice was calm, the kind that doesn't rush to fill silence. "That looks heavy," he said gently, nodding toward Daniel's shoulders. Daniel blinked, slightly puzzled, then gave a small laugh. "Heavy?" he replied. "There's nothing there." The man smiled, not in disagreement, but in quiet understanding. "Ah," he said, "the heaviest things are often the ones no one else can see." Daniel shifted a little on the stone ledge. Somehow, the stranger's words landed closer to the truth than he expected. It felt almost as if the man had noticed the sack before Daniel had ever mentioned it. For a moment, they simply watched the slow swirl of water in the fountain. Then the stranger gestured lightly with his hand. "Tell me," he said, "how long have you been carrying that sack of stones?" Daniel frowned, though a hint of amusement crept into his expression. "If I had such a thing," he said, "I suppose I've had it for years." The stranger nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. "Most people do," he said softly. "They pick up stones throughout the day. A careless word, a worry about tomorrow, an old memory that refuses to sit quietly. Instead of letting those stones fall back to the path, they tuck them safely into a sack and carry them everywhere." Daniel felt an odd mixture of relief and curiosity. The stranger spoke about the sack as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. No judgment, no surprise, just quiet recognition. It made Daniel realize he had never spoken about the weight before, not even to himself. "But if I don't hold on to them," Daniel said after a pause, "how will I learn from them?" The stranger chuckled softly, the warm kind of chuckle that feels more like sunlight than laughter. "Learning from a stone," he replied, "doesn't require carrying it forever." Daniel looked down at the cobblestones again, imagining the sack on his back. The thought of setting it down still felt strange, almost irresponsible. Yet something in the stranger's calm presence made the idea feel less frightening, as if perhaps the mind, like a river, was meant to keep moving. The stranger leaned back slightly and added one last thought, almost casually. "Thoughts are visitors," he said. "They're meant to pass through the house, not move in and fill every room." And with that quiet sentence hanging in the air, Daniel began to wonder what it might feel like to open the door and let a few of them leave. The stranger rested his hands on the cool stone edge of the fountain, watching the ripples glide across the water. For a while he said nothing, as though allowing the evening itself to do part of the teaching. Daniel shifted slightly, still feeling the familiar pull of the sack on his shoulders. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt oddly spacious. After a moment, The stranger reached down and picked up a small pebble from the ground. He held it in his palm and studied it with quiet curiosity. "Let's say this is one of your thoughts," he said gently. Daniel leaned forward a little, intrigued despite himself. The pebble was simple, ordinary, yet the stranger held it as if it carried meaning. "Most people do this," the man continued, closing his fist tightly around the pebble. His knuckles turned pale as he squeezed. They gripped the thought. Turn it over again and again. Try to squeeze an answer out of it. He paused, then slowly opened his hand. The pebble rested calmly in his palm. But the thought was never the problem. The gripping was. Daniel watched the small demonstration with surprising attention. It was such a simple gesture, yet something about it felt quietly revealing. He imagined every stone in his sack being squeezed like that, worry pressed against worry, memory against memory, until the mind had no room left to breathe. Then the stranger bent slightly and placed the pebble back onto the ground beside his foot, not thrown away, just returned to the earth where it had been. "Surrender," he said softly, "is not throwing the stone into the river and pretending it never existed. It's simply placing it down when your hand grows tired." Daniel felt his shoulders loosen a fraction as he pictured it. One stone resting on the ground instead of rattling inside the sack. The image felt strangely peaceful. For a moment, he even inhaled a deeper breath than usual, as though his lungs had found a little extra space. "Try something small," the stranger added. "Close your eyes for one breath. Imagine one stone leaving the sack, perhaps the lightest one. Set it gently beside you. Then open your eyes." Daniel hesitated, then did exactly that. One slow breath in, one slow breath out, and in his mind, a small stone rolled quietly onto the cobblestones. When he opened his eyes again, nothing in the square had changed. The fountain still murmured softly. The lantern still glowed near the doorway. Yet Daniel noticed something subtle. The sack on his shoulders felt just a little lighter. Not empty, but no longer quite as tight. The stranger smiled faintly, as though he had seen this moment many times before. "You see," he said calmly, "peace doesn't arrive because the stones disappear. It arrives because space begins to open around them." And as Daniel considered that quiet truth, a new and unfamiliar curiosity began to form. What might happen if he set down another stone tomorrow? The next morning arrived quietly, the way gentle mornings often do. Sunlight slipped through Daniel's window and rested softly on the wooden floor. For a few seconds after waking, his mind did what it always did. It reached for the sack. A small worry about yesterday's unfinished task tried to roll forward like one of the familiar stones. But something different happened this time. Daniel remembered the stranger's hand opening slowly, the pebble resting calmly in the palm, so he paused right there in bed, before the thoughts could gather too tightly. One breath in, one breath out. In his mind, he imagined lifting that small stone from the sack and placing it on a quiet shelf beside him. The thought didn't disappear completely. It hovered nearby, curious, as if wondering why it hadn't been invited back into the bag. For a moment, Daniel felt a flicker of discomfort. His mind whispered, "You should pick that up again. What if you forget something important?" Yet the stranger's voice echoed gently in memory. Thoughts are visitors. So Daniel allowed the stone to remain where it was. Not rejected, not fought, simply resting outside the sack. He stood up, stretched his shoulders, and noticed something almost surprising. The invisible weight he carried each morning felt slightly lighter. Not dramatically lighter, but enough to make his steps feel less heavy. Throughout the day, new stones tried to sneak into the bag as usual. A short message that sounded colder than expected. A brief moment of embarrassment when he stumbled over his words. Each one tapped politely at the opening of the sack, and sometimes, out of habit, Daniel almost dropped them in without thinking. But now and then, he paused, just a breath or two. He pictured the stone in his hand and quietly set it down in his imagination. The action took no more than a few seconds. Sometimes he even smiled at the simplicity of it, as though he had spent years carrying luggage that had wheels the entire time. Of course, the mind protested now and then. Old habits rarely disappear overnight. A few heavier stones still slipped into the sack before he noticed. Yet even then, Daniel had begun to understand something new. The sack was no longer sealed shut. The stones could come out again, and little by little something remarkable began to happen. The sack itself started to change. What once felt like a dense bundle of burdens now seemed looser, almost thinner. Some evenings Daniel would walk past the fountain and realize that the stones inside had grown strangely quiet, as if they were slowly dissolving in the open air of a mind learning how to rest. A few days later, Daniel found himself in a moment that would once have filled his sack within seconds. It happened in the market square, near the stall where the baker sold warm bread each morning. Someone behind him spoke sharply after he accidentally stepped aside too slowly. The words weren't cruel exactly, but they carried that familiar sting that usually lingered long after the moment passed. For a split second, the old reflex returned. Daniel felt the sack tug at his shoulders, ready to swallow another stone. His mind began its usual rehearsal. Why did they say that? Did I look foolish? Should I have answered differently? The questions lined up like eager travelers waiting to climb into the bag. But then something gentle interrupted the rush. Daniel remembered the small pebble resting in the stranger's open hand. He paused where he stood, taking one quiet breath while the sounds of the market carried on around him. In his imagination, he held the new stone between his fingers. Normally, the stone would have dropped straight into the sack. Yet this time he did something different. He pictured himself placing it on the wooden edge of the bread stall instead. Not thrown away, not denied. Simply set down where it could rest without being carried. The moment passed more quickly than he expected. The person who had spoken sharply had already moved on, busy with their own morning. The market continued its cheerful rhythm. Coins clinking, laughter drifting through the air, the scent of fresh bread curling through the breeze. Daniel realized the world had not paused to inspect his reaction. And surprisingly, neither had his mind. The usual storm of thoughts had softened into something quieter. The stone remained on the imagined shelf beside him, still visible, yet no longer weighing down the sack. Daniel even allowed himself a small smile, the kind that appears when someone discovers a door they never noticed before. Later that afternoon, another moment arrived, a brief misunderstanding in a conversation. The old Daniel would have replayed it 10 times before dinner. But now he simply paused again, just long enough for a breath to settle. The stone appeared, and once more, it found a place outside the sack. By evening, Daniel returned to the fountain and noticed something curious. The sack still existed, of course, but it no longer clung so tightly to his shoulders. Some stones had been quietly returned to the path, others rested peacefully on nearby shelves of thought, and the space inside his mind felt wider than it had in years. Across the square, the stranger appeared again, walking slowly beneath the lantern light. He didn't say anything right away, yet the gentle look in his eyes seemed to ask a quiet question, whether Daniel had begun to discover how light the journey becomes when the hands finally stop gripping every stone. That evening, Daniel sat beside the fountain again, though something about his posture had changed. His shoulders rested lower, as if they had quietly negotiated peace with the invisible sack. The stranger sat nearby, tracing slow circles on the stone edge with one finger. For a while they listened to the water moving through the fountain's basin. Then the stranger spoke again, softly, almost like sharing a small secret. "Most stones are lighter than we think," he said. "They only feel heavy because we hold them too long." Daniel nodded, watching a fallen leaf drift across the water's surface. He understood the idea now, at least a little. Yet he also knew how quickly the mind could forget, especially on busy days when thoughts crowded the doorway all at once. The stranger picked up another small pebble from the ground and placed it gently on the fountain's edge. "There's a small practice," he continued, "that takes less than a minute." Daniel looked up with quiet curiosity. The man's voice carried the calm confidence of someone describing something simple, almost playful. "Whenever the mind feels crowded," the stranger said, "pause for one slow breath." He lifted the pebble between 2 fingers. "Then imagine placing just one thought somewhere outside the sack, perhaps on a shelf beside you, perhaps floating into the wide sky above. It doesn't matter where, as long as your hands stop gripping it." Daniel tried it right there beside the fountain. A familiar worry appeared, something about tomorrow's conversation at work. He pictured the stone clearly, round and gray like the one in the stranger's hand. Then, with a quiet breath, he imagined placing it on the fountain's edge beside the other pebble. The effect was small but unmistakable. His mind felt less crowded, like a room where one chair had been moved aside. Nothing magical had happened. The thought still existed somewhere nearby, yet it no longer pressed against every corner of his attention. The stranger chuckled softly. "You see, the mind enjoys space the way lungs enjoy air." Daniel smiled at the comparison. It felt strangely accurate. For years he had tried to organize every stone inside the sack, yet the real relief came not from arranging them, but from allowing a few of them to rest elsewhere. The lantern light flickered across the square as the evening deepened. Daniel realized this tiny practice could follow him anywhere, during a tense conversation, while lying awake at night, even in the middle of a crowded street. Just one breath, one stone placed gently outside the sack, and as the fountain murmured steadily beside them, the stranger looked up at the open sky above the rooftops, as if preparing to share one final image about what happens when the sack grows light enough for the mind to see the horizon again. The stranger stood slowly from the edge of the fountain and looked toward the quiet sky above the rooftops. The night had opened wide, scattered with patient stars that seemed to blink without hurry. Daniel followed his gaze, noticing how spacious the sky felt compared to the crowded rooms of his mind from days before. The sack still rested somewhere behind him, yet it no longer defined the way he stood. People often think peace arrives when the mind becomes empty, the stranger said gently. But the mind was never meant to be empty. He nudged a small pebble with the tip of his shoe, letting it roll softly across the cobblestones. Peace comes when the hands loosen, when thoughts are allowed to move the way clouds move. Daniel considered the image. Clouds didn't argue with the sky. They didn't cling to it or demand permanent space. They appeared, drifted quietly across the horizon, and eventually dissolved into something larger than themselves. The sky never needed to control them. For a long moment he simply breathed, noticing how different the world felt without gripping every passing thought. The stones still existed, of course. Some would appear tomorrow. Others might try to return from the past. Yet now he understood something simple that had somehow been forgotten. The sack had never been the enemy. Thoughts themselves had never been the enemy. The real weight had come from holding each stone as if it were permanent, from believing every thought demanded a lifetime of attention. But the moment the grip softened, space began to appear. Quiet, gentle space. Daniel looked down at the cobblestones where several imaginary stones now rested peacefully outside the sack. The path ahead seemed lighter somehow, not because life had changed, but because his hands had. For the first time in a long while, walking forward felt natural again. The stranger turned toward the narrow street leading away from the square. His steps were slow, unhurried, as though he had nowhere urgent to be. Before leaving, he glanced back once more and offered a final quiet thought. The sky has room for every cloud, he said, and the mind has room for every thought. Once we remember, we don't have to hold them all. Daniel remained beside the fountain, watching the open sky stretch peacefully above the sleeping town. The sack rested nearby, lighter now, almost forgotten. And in that wide silence, something new settled gently into his awareness. The quiet freedom of a mind that had finally remembered how to let the wind carry a few stones away.